Good evening to our distinguished guests joining from around the world. Thank you so much for participating in this working session. I want to welcome all of you to the T20 TF4 working session at the Global Solutions Summit, Transforming the Food System, Solutions for Sustainable and Equitable Food Security. This working session is hosted by the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies together with IPB University as the co-hosts of the T20 TF4 on Food Security and Sustainable Agriculture. We want to thank the Global Solutions Initiative as well for providing the space for the discussion today. My name is Felipa Amanta. I'm the head of research at CHIPS and also the coordinator for Task Force 4, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Just to set the context for today's discussion, global food security has significantly improved in the past 2 decades due to continuous agriculture and industrial innovations, as well as greater global food trade. However, as the ongoing global pandemic and the war in Ukraine are showing us, the global food system is still vulnerable to shocks. In the past 2 years, the number of undernourished population have increased to more than 800 million people, concentrated in low and middle income countries. And looking ahead, threats of climate change, environmental degradation will also exacerbate the vulnerabilities of the food system, which will bring us further away from achieving our sustainable development goal of no hunger. Thus, we urgently need global solutions for a more resilient, sustainable, and equitable food system. And so to that end, we are joined by a group of wonderful experts to discuss this matter. First, I want to introduce Professor Damayanti Buchori from IPB University. She is the lead co-chair of T20's Task Force 4 on Food Security and Sustainable Agriculture. So in her role, Professor Dami has been leading the T20 Task Force 4 to focus our priorities as well as in developing the policy recommendations to the G20. Professor Dami will open our discussion today with a short 10-minute presentation summarizing the key issues that we want to prioritize in the task force, as well as the recommendations from the task force. After Professor Dami's presentation, we will then invite our esteemed panelists to provide their feedback. Their perspectives will really enrich the recommendations coming from the T20, which will then be submitted to the G20. And today we are joined by 3 experts. We have Dr. Shenggen Fan, Dean of Academy of Global Food Economics and Policy and Chair Professor at China Agricultural University. We also have Professor Dr. Joachim von Braun, Distinguished Professor at Economics and Technical Change Center for Development Research at University of Bonn. We also have Dr. Martin Frick, Director of the World Food Program Global Office at Berlin. So each of our experts today will have approximately 7 minutes to respond to Professor Dami's presentation and also provide feedback. Afterwards, we will then open the space for discussion with our workshop participants. So we invite you to join us and make this a two-way conversation with the audience as well if you have questions or if you have comments to the task force. Okay, without further ado, I will invite our lead co-chair for the task force, Professor Damayanti Buchori of IPB University, to start our discussion. Professor Damayanti, you have 10 minutes and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pipa. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for the invitation. Also, a deep thank you to the panelists, Professor Joachim, Dr. Martin, and also Professor Shenggen. It's an honor to have you in this event today. I think I would like to start with providing just a short framework of what G20 Indonesia is about. So here, I think I'm just putting this up together for all of us so we can see together. So this is the G20 Indonesia framework, and there are 3 pillars that the G20 is focusing on. The first pillar is the global health architecture. The second pillar is the digital economy transformation. And the third pillar is the energy transition, particularly how it relates to the climate change. Okay, and then there's the cross-cutting issue, digitalization economy, strengthening MSME, and so on and so forth. So this will be the overarching issue that the task force on agriculture should be focusing on. And in Indonesia, we see that for the T20 Indonesia, there are several considerations that we should look at. And first of all, we understand that there was already a previous T20, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and then there will be the future T20 India. So we think that it's also important that we see what have been done in the past and how will the T20 on food security and sustainable agriculture have taken that policy brief in the past to make it become continuous. So there's a continuity for the T20 Indonesia, and then also in the future for the T20 India. So we think that it's important not to reinvent the wheel, but also understanding and questioning what has been put out there and what happened to it. Okay, the next is that when we first started the T20 Indonesia, it was with the understanding that the world is on its road to recovery. And then all of a sudden the Russian invasion came in. So the state of the global cooperation is now being questioned. And then there's a persistent fundamental problems that we see that is still going on. Worsening inequality, consumption and climate change, consumption of loss and biodiversity, etc. Yesterday, Dennis Snower, when he presented a talk yesterday, there's a quote that I put down here because I thought it's very interesting. And what he said yesterday was that globalization is associated with lots of failures, or he mentioned that a lot of people have been looking at globalization is associated with lots of failures, small-scale farmers disempowerment, etc. So he was stressing that we need to change the way we do things. So with that, I would like to start looking at the policy recommendations that this task force have been working with the policy authors. So altogether, we have 10 policy areas. And okay, I did not put the 10 policy areas here, but basically the 10 policy areas here are the agricultural trade and global value chain, and then food system resilient, nature positive agriculture production, increasing agriculture productivity, rethinking agricultural subsidy to benefit farmers, reducing food loss and food waste, food access, affordability, and literacy and sustainable consumption, land ownership, livelihood of smallholder farming, future farming, and financing sustainable agriculture. After that policy areas was developed, then we received about 109 abstracts for policy briefs. And then after several weeks of deliberation and selection, we finally came up with 15 policy briefs. And I will present just a quick overview of what those policy briefs consist. The first recommendation, the first policy recommendation is that it is important for us to build a resilient agri-food system. How do we do that? By guaranteeing diversity in food sources, supply and output markets through diversifying production, foodstuff, imports, international trade partners, and also developing and maintaining robust food transport networks, tailoring policy based on country-specific challenges in providing economic access to healthy diets. The next recommendation is on agriculture and trade policy to achieve equity among countries' competitiveness. Now, this idea is very, I think, straightforward, and it's really stressing that the G20 countries need to modify its trade policy measures, particularly the non-tariff measures, to ensure fair competitiveness condition, and then also reduce domestic agricultural sector initiative and aligning their technical measures with the international SPS. For the developing countries, it is very important to increase investment in quality infrastructure with science and technology, and also initiate domestic policy that promote quality export and ensure sustainability. There was also a recommendation on digital transformation of agriculture and food system. Basically, this digital transformation, it's developing a pathway for a greater socioeconomic inclusion, sustainability, and international cooperation. So there's a wide policy framework that has to be developed for the digital transformation. Agriculture can develop a food system that is fair and also sustainable. The next recommendation is okay. So this is the more detailed explanation about what specific action that needs to be conducted to enhance digital investment, and then strategy to improve enabling environment, cross-cutting sectoral actions. For instance, ICT, trade, sustainability, finance, and then international cooperation and governance for architecture leveraging the G20 process to optimize their role. The next recommendation is on repurposing agricultural policy support to meet the global climate and food security goals. Developing common framework is important, particularly as it is linked to phasing out the harmful policy and repurposing resource toward measures that incentivize sustainable agriculture practices. And then how to establish and strengthen mechanism for international cooperation. This would include reactivation of the WTO agricultural trade negotiations. Future farming in a data-driven world. This is something that is a bit unique, I think, because it is asking whether it's possible to develop a global multi-stakeholder tracking hub for investments in agri-food innovation. And also, there's this already existing global Earth observation on global agriculture monitoring mechanism that was actually endorsed in the 2011 G20 summit. So it's asking what happened to that GeoGLAM tools and whether it can be used for benefit of small-scale farmers. The next recommendation is about rural transformation and farmers' livelihood. And it's important to be inclusive in upgrading particular focus on governance and justice, and also helping leveraging the medium-sized sector, which is often underdeveloped. I think what is interesting with this policy recommendation for the T20 is that we are also starting to integrate the blue food into the food system policy, managing blue food as an integral part of the food system. Reducing food loss and food waste, I think, is still the same with what has happened in the Italy and other T20 meetings. And then also the circular bioeconomy and innovative urban food management. So this is important that when we are talking about agriculture, it's not only just speaking in terms of rural, but how is it that urban food should be included in food security, and the food waste management in the urban areas is very important. So circular bioeconomy should be included in the food security and sustainable agriculture. Okay, so this last one, I think is just going to stress that there are recurrent issues in all T20 that has been developed so far. The question is, how do we turn this commitment into reality? And I still see that actually in this policy brief that was developed by the authors, there are still policy gaps. So, and in this opportunity, we really need your input, and if possible, develop where the gaps are to make the T20 communique become more complete to be submitted to the G20 panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Budami. Thank you, Professor Dami, for that introduction and also sharing with us the extensive and wide-ranging policy recommendations from the task force. I think this is a good starting point for our discussion, and we would love to hear from our other panelists today to provide response, feedback, or comments. So I want to start with Dr. Shungan Fan. One of the policy areas that Professor Dami mentioned was on rural transformation. And so if you can touch on that and provide any other comments that you have, the Zoom is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I think Dr. Damayanti's presentation is very comprehensive. Yeah, I wanted to highlight how can we deal with some of the urgent issues of Russian and Ukraine crisis that have led some of the global food price rise. We must take some urgent actions on a couple of things. One is we must make sure that the global trade remains open. No country should use export bans to keep food domestically at the cost of others. And the second is the biofuel production. How can we really stop the link between higher oil price, higher energy price, and the biofuel production? So we have seen some countries already began to scale up biofuel production at the cost of hungry people's food. So that's number two. Number three is social protection. Poor and hungry people need to be protected when food prices go up. So we got to make sure that social protection will be there to ensure the poor continue to have access to food. Now, finally, I think many countries, particularly northern part of the planet, will come to the spring planting season. We must make sure that the farmers have access to seeds, to fertilizers, to inputs, to make sure that we can harvest good crop in summer, because this crisis, current crisis, will remain for some time. Let me come back to the questions you asked me, the link to rural economy. I think the challenges we face today from our food system, the challenges we're facing in our rural areas, our rural economy, are very much related to our food system. So number one is the environmental challenge. In the past, we used lots of water, lots of energy, and lots of, let's say, inputs in producing sufficient grains to feed billions of people. Yeah, the Green Revolution was very typical. But yeah, that was successful. Today, it seems to me the environmental degradation, even the contribution to climate change, very much came from unsustainable food system we have been practicing. So the rural areas, environmental challenges largely came from our food system. The second is malnutrition. Yeah, we always heard about multiple burdens of nutrition, undernutrition, lack of micronutrients, hidden hunger, and overweight, obesity. Again, the rural areas, rural population account for a big share of malnourished population, and they come from our food system, because our food system have not been able to produce healthy, nutritious for everybody. The number three is exclusion. We know that women, smallholders, and disadvantaged groups are excluded from rural economies or from overall economy. And this is particularly true in our food systems. The smallholders do not have adequate access to finance, to technical services, to market. A woman, as a smallholder, are particularly vulnerable, particularly disadvantaged. They're obviously youth. So the exclusion in our society, exclusion in rural economy, also came from exclusion in our food system. So how can we move this forward? I think I very much agree with that brief that we needed to repurpose subsidy. Probably we call it repurpose or optimize support. Make sure that the support, new support, will not only make sure that our food system will be sustainable, will produce healthy, nutritious foods, but also to promote so-called shared prosperity between rural and urban areas, and even within rural areas. So shared prosperity and for rural development. So repurposing is not just for agricultural food system itself, but also for rural development. So number two is to empower disadvantaged groups, women, and smallholders, and low income or unemployed population. I think the food system can do more to really include all these people, to make sure that they are empowered, they benefit, and they can really take actions to, let's say, to move them up and to help upgrade food system. I also wanted to mention sort of government social protection program are important to protect the poor in rural areas in food system. But there are also a lot of informal or NGO type of groups. For example, the food banks in India, food banks in emerging economies, many other countries, can really fill the gap left by the government. So food banks can also help to reduce food waste and loss because they can help, let's say, to receive the donations of foods from, let's say, from the supply chains, from grocery stores, to be expired foods. So the food banks can use them and to redistribute them to the people who are in need. I think now the food prices are rising, COVID is still there. I think these sort of non-governmental NGOs, charity organization, can feel very big. Finally, is governance. If we want to tackle the food system, tackle the rural areas, the challenges of this are very complex in food system areas. We need to bring different government ministries together. It's not just health, environment, climate change. So all this have to come together. So any government should set up coordination mechanisms. Here in China, they used to have a national leadership group on agriculture. So that group was able to bring different ministries together to set the priorities, to make decisions on anything related to agriculture. But today we need a similar mechanism for food systems to bring the climate change, bring the environment, bring the agriculture, bring health, nutrition, rural development all together. I will end over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Shengen, for that comments. We will move on to the other panelists, but before we move to Dr. Joachim, I want to also invite the audience today. Feel free to make this a two-way conversation. So if you have comments or questions, you can drop them in the chat box at any point during the discussion. We can pick it up later after in the Q&A session. But now let's move on to Dr. Joachim von Braun. Governance is the key issues and the themes that keep popping up. So maybe you can share your perspective, and you have 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman. Let me first make a few comments on the framework and the priorities presented by Professor Damayanti Buchori. I very much appreciate the themes, the priorities which you have laid out. And I think it's great. I see a lot of coherence of your proposed T20 themes in this field with the outcomes of the United Nations Food Systems Summit that was held last year. I put into the chat box a link to a major set of 50 papers, actually, of the scientific group that provided scientific support for the action agenda of the summit. So you find even more information there. I also appreciate that difficult topics are not precluded from the agenda, such as the Russian invasion into Ukraine and their tremendous ripple effects on the world food markets. So the conflict issue is something which the G20 need guidance from T20 for, so that the disruptions of food systems are not too severe. I feel with the agriculture trade agenda, you have placed a high priority on a key area, as is with resilience. The COP26 has not sufficiently emphasized resilience, especially of emerging economy countries, and has neglected food and agriculture. If you look into the outcome statement of COP26, the word agriculture, the word food does nowhere appear. That must change in COP27, and T20 can engage in that. I am excited about your proposal of a hub for agricultural innovation. That is, I think, a very interesting initiative. The world needs that because the transformation of the food system must come through innovation, through science and innovation, science-based innovations, technical, biological, institutional innovations. I would like to make a couple of points as our chair has suggested I focus on governance issues, which my colleague Shengeng Fang already touched upon. The international governance of the food system has failed or shows failure under stress. And we currently are under stress, the climate stress, the conflict stress, and the consequences of impacts on markets, in addition to the pandemic stress. We cannot afford to work with national or local solutions only. We need a revised food system governance. The United Nations can play a key role in that. Maybe we need something like a food systems stability board. We have a financial system stability board in the world because the financial markets sometimes need coordinated action. We need something like that for the food system, and that should be supported by a science-based body, something like an IPCC for food, although the food system is different than the climate system, in which consensus of best science comes together into a structured dialogue with political leadership. We need governance also to finance the end of hunger at global scale. The international finance organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the regional banks, the strong ones in Asia in particular, need to come together with a coherent finance agenda, because transforming the food system towards sustainability, effectiveness, and being nature positive costs money. And that needs to be mobilized because it has, at a global scale, because it has global public goods effects. Lastly, we need a governance action for short-term crisis prevention. The poor cannot wait. Those who increasingly are hungry now because of income failure and high prices cannot wait until next year. We must look to G20 to propose coherent action in the policies to release grain stocks to bring prices down for those countries like China and India who have high stocks, and Europe. And we need to have measures to bring down the use of feed for animal products for the next half year, because the short-term action on the price front is required, as well as my colleague Shengeng Fang already said, for the social protection area. We need to work on both fronts, bring prices down, bring social protection up. Both cost money and concerted action. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Joachim, for that perspective. And following up on the issue of conflict, I want to turn to Dr. Martin Frick, as the WFP has been at the forefront of humanitarian action in terms of providing food. So in a year of unprecedented humanitarian needs, how do you think we can improve food security in a world riddled by multiple crises? So the floor is yours, Dr. Martin.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you also, Professor Dami, for the great presentation. It's good to see G20 leadership in food systems, and thank you, Professor Shan and Professor von Braun, for the very pertinent comments. We have been talking the beginning of this year already, before the war in Ukraine started, about a ring of fire of hunger. In the 2 years of COVID, we have seen the immediate need of people being in severe food insecure situations going up from 135 million to 276 million. And that is not yet the full brunt of the COVID crisis. And on top of that comes now the Ukraine war. If you look at the main drivers of hunger in the world, we used to say it's 3 C's: conflict, climate change, and COVID. Now it's 4. It's conflict, climate change, COVID, and costs. Now, what is driving food insecurity still, like nothing else, is conflict. The Ukraine war is certainly one of these conflicts the world cannot afford, because a country of 40 million is actually feeding 400 million. And within a space of 4 weeks, it has become from an exporter of food to a food insecure country in which WFP is scaling up operations in order to reach prospectively 3 million people, while 3.6 million people have already fled. This comes on top of a whole series of conflicts that we did not have in 2008. So this food price crisis comes at a much more difficult moment. Think about protracted crises like the conflict in Yemen or in Ethiopia. In Afghanistan, we are still massively working every month to get people alive and to get them through the winter that is about to stop. But even in Afghanistan, you see the impact of climate change, because water is getting scarce in spring for agriculture, which is a function of not enough ice and snow on the mountains, which shows the impact of climate change. Now, in a world coined by insecurity and volatility, one thing we ironically know for certain is that the impacts of climate change will not only stay with us, they will actually intensify. A little bit overshadowed by the Ukraine war was the presentation of the progress report of the Working Group 2 of IPCC on the 28th of February that said in no uncertain terms 2 things. One, that we already see the impact of climate change in global food prices, and B, that we urgently need to build resilience in agricultural systems and in food systems in general. Now, COVID has not only costed way too many lives, it has also exposed the vulnerabilities of the global system, and answering to COVID has costed a staggering $26 trillion so far. So in countries that are already suffering from poor economics, from poor infrastructure, from all sorts of vulnerabilities, the value of the currencies are depreciating. The economic power is just not there, and the countries of the developing world are more in debt than any before. And on top of these 3 C's comes now exploding costs for food, for staple foods such as wheat or sunflower oil, of which, as it's largely known, Russia and Ukraine hold 30% in wheat and way above that in vegetable oil and in sunflower oil. But it also has triggered a spike in energy costs and in the costs of fertilizer. This will perpetuate the problems we are having now with the global food system. The war in Ukraine, one of the consequences is that currently the growing season cannot be used, as the farmers are in war, as fuel is lacking for agriculture, and this will be felt for a long time. Now, what can be done? I entirely agree to the points made by Schengen Fan and Joachim von Braun. And I'm talking to you currently from Dakar, West Africa, where we have regional meetings. And if you see the multiple stresses on the region and the really, really tense situation, I think we need to start from the bottom up to help local communities improve their food security, getting their land back to agricultural use, pushing back the desert, planting trees, building up soils, composting, harvesting water, better usage of water are topics that come to mind. But also access to modern energy infrastructures, such as access to mobile communication, electricity, and even things like decentralized solar-powered warehouses that can help the farmers come to the market at points where they can achieve higher prices and at the same time can benefit from solar energy for charging mobile phones, for having access to information, and also for storing vaccines if they should come available. But on the basis of that is the need to urgently strengthen government structures, provide for basic security, provide 10-year security, particularly for women. So in a sense, many of the countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, have become over the last decades way too dependent on foreign imports. And we have to help the countries immediately by the measures that have been laid out by the panelists ahead of me. But we also have to build the local capacity to build and grow food that is consumed locally, not only to provide for the calories, but also from a nutrition aspect, and certainly from an aspect of climate change, adaptation, of building resilience, and making countries less vulnerable to shocks to the system as we currently witness in the Ukraine crisis. So let me stop at this point, and I'm happy to take questions, and back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin Frick. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for sharing your perspectives and remarks. Let's now turn to question and answer. And I want to invite all of our audience and participants today. You can ask the question in the chat box, and then we can answer together. So I see that there are already some questions. Let's start with this one from Dira about financing, because as we have mentioned, all of these multiple goals of nutrition, of food security, of environment would need cost and financing. And I think Dr. Joachim von Braun have already started answering. If you want to elaborate, and then maybe I can turn to Professor Dami as well to provide the perspective from the task force. To Professor von Braun.
Thank you. The concept to finance our pathways out of the food crisis has been on our agenda in the discussion around the Food Systems Summit. What we have come up with, and I've put a source into the chat box, relates to a massive scaling up of special drawing rights through the International Monetary Fund as a source to back anti-hunger bonds, country by country, issued by the nations themselves, adjusted to their circumstances. So we need new ways to finance, to mobilize finance through the public entities, but we also need the private sector, the banks, to step up to finance the pathways out of the food crisis. So more detail is in the paper which I have put into the chat box from our colleagues at the International Food Policy Research Institute. There is actually follow-up by International Fund for Agriculture Development, IFAD, on the finance strategies, and the G20 would have to play a key role in this.
Thank you, Dr. von Braun. I want to turn to Professor Damayanti, please.
Okay, thank you, Pippa. Well, actually, I really would like to thank Professor Joachim, because this is something that is actually still lacking in our policy brief. So we've been discussing about, okay, how to finance. So in this opportunity, well, Professor Joachim is just next to me here. So thank you so much for that, because that will definitely, we will definitely include that into our policy brief. But aside from that, though, I think there is also a local capacity that we should not underestimate. So financing, looking at international institution is one thing. Looking at the government, the national government is another thing. But there's actually also a power in local community that we've seen over the years. And well, this is more maybe because of experiences in Indonesia. But when a lot of people, they come together, maybe it doesn't need a lot of money, but the commitment to make a change, that is also, I think, very important. So in addition to the finances that we should look at the national and global, I think there's a local strength that can be tapped on. I think that's my addition to what Professor Joaquin has given. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dami. The next question is from Julie, and this goes to Dr. Martin Frick about the transition, especially in African countries, to reduce their dependency on food imports. So what are the barriers right now to this transition, and how do you think that agro-food corporations will react about the transition to local food production?
Well, thank you. We are currently at a regional conference for Sahelian countries. And I think in Sahelian countries, the problem of exports is not that big one. It is actually a dependency that grew from foreign imports that used to provide a cheap alternative and stacking up food supplies. But it turned out to be a dependency that is something that the countries cannot afford anymore. I want to refer to the point that Professor Dami just made about the power of local communities. We are running projects here in which we particularly support women in restoring land, in applying an old rediscovered technology called Sain, in which you basically dig half moons in the land and collect the rainwater, and in the center of it, you plant trees. These very low-tech approaches are actually working to create better food security on the ground. And I also touched upon that we are not only having a situation in which it's difficult to get enough calories to the population, but it's certainly also a nutrition crisis. You cannot have a population entirely dependent on staple crops. So supporting local population is also improving nutrition, particularly for women and children, which is absolutely essential. Now, on the model of exporting and instead or contraposing to local production of food, I think there is a question of the right balance of the usage of the land and also of fair pay and a certain quality that can command prices on the world markets to provide for this balance. But in the 5+1 Sahelian countries, I think local production is absolutely essential, also as a basis to stabilize the region, where we see that the desperation of people often drives them in the hands of extremist groups, and that risks in return further weakening of the governance structures which are so urgently needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frick. While we wait for other questions, I have one question I want to pose to Dr. Schengenfan, because I think you put it very, very perfectly about the need to make sure that all of the goals of rural development, of food security, of nutrition, of health, of environment, all comes together. We see that studies are showing sometimes it can be trade-offs between these goals, for example, on healthy diets and environmental sustainability, or on environmental sustainability certification and the costs of production. So how do you think we should address these trade-offs in the solution?
Yeah, I think the trade-offs are there partly because of the policy failures. So for example, we have been subsidizing water, fertilizers, and producing grains, rice, wheat, and maize, at the cost of fruits, vegetables, more nutritious foods. So these trade-offs came from bad policy. So how can we fix it? Repurposing it, reuse that money. And can we remove some of the subsidies, water, fertilizer subsidies, to support production of nutritious and healthy foods, fruits, vegetables, beans, and beyond? So the potential is great. So the analysis from IPRI, from even our own work here in China, shows that if we can repurpose, if we can reposition subsidies, we can achieve it's a lower carbon, high nutritious, and high efficient, even very inclusive food systems. For example, smallholders will be able to benefit by producing more fruits, vegetables, and much more profitable than producing rice and wheat. So I think we should not miss this opportunity. The G20 or T20 must put this as one of the high priorities.
Thank you, Dr. Schengen. We have 5 minutes left, so I think we can pick up on 1 or 2 last questions very quickly before we end the meeting. Perhaps before I will let Budami to provide closing remarks in a bit. But before that, I'll pick up this question from Krista about how to enable and drive the digital transformation of agriculture. Are there specific mechanisms and policy actions that are imperative for this transformation? Maybe I will ask that to Dr. von Braun. You're still on mute.
Yes, happy to respond to that. We have made this one of our 7 top priorities of science and innovation action for the transformation of food systems in the UN Food System Summit process. Key here is access, so connectivity, that's public goods investments. Secondly, content, that's where lots of startup initiatives and pharma and value chain actors engage. The capabilities of farming communities to actually utilize digitization is key. And there is beautiful work on how digitized extension services enhance productivity and inclusiveness of women. So it requires public and private investment to come together. And there are some excellent role models which have been identified. You find a set of papers on that in the Food System Summit progress reports. Asia is in the lead there. China, I think, and India and Indonesia can teach a lot of lessons to the rest of the world in this whole field.
Thank you, Dr. von Braun. Okay, I think we're almost out of time, so I will provide the floor to Dr. Dami to provide closing remarks before I close the session.
Okay, thank you, Pipa. Well, I think I would like to quote the Secretary General of the United Nations, who mentioned that the food system is failing. And he said that in the UN Food Summit, based on the data that actually there is enough food to feed the 7.8 billion people. However, 690 million are hungry. So there definitely is something wrong with the food system. It is time to reshape, time to rebuild, and this needs international collaboration, global collaboration across all countries. So because of the pandemic, the war, the climate crisis, we cannot wait anymore. It is time to act. The commitment should be realized. Together we can recover together, recover stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dami. And thank you everyone for participating in today's working session. I apologize that we didn't have the chance to answer all of your questions, but thank you nonetheless for participating in the discussion. And I also want to extend my highest appreciation to our panelists today, to Professor Damayanti, to Dr. Schengen Fan, to Dr. Martin Frick, and Dr. Joachim von Braun for your excellent remarks. Before we end the meeting, I'd like to ask all of our participants to fill in a very quick survey of our side events. The link to the survey is shared in the chat box at the moment, and your feedback will really help us improve our events in the future. So again, you can find the link in the chat box, and please take your time, a very, very quick survey that will help our side events. Once again, thank you so much for your participation and active discussion. I hope you have a great rest of your day, afternoon, or evening. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay healthy.